All right. Happy Moundville Monday to everybody. We are going to be doing another Museums from Your Home live stream this morning. We're going to just take a few seconds to verify that we are live on Facebook and YouTube, just making sure everything's working properly before we get started. So we have ready to go. So this is very fast. YouTube and Facebook are on it this morning. Everything is looking like we are live. So feel free to come by and ask us any questions in the comments. If you have them, we've got a really cool topic today. So I guess we'll go ahead and get started if that's okay with you, Lindsay. You ready to go?
Wonderful. Let's do it.
All right. Welcome to today's Museums from Your Home live stream presented by the University of Alabama Museums. My name is Rebecca Johnson, and I'm the Communication Specialist for UA Museums. And with me today is Lindsay Gordon, the Education Outreach Coordinator at Moundville Archaeological Park, and I guess the star of Moundville Mondays. So if you want to learn more about Moundville, definitely check that out. Hashtag Moundville Mondays. All right, so we have a special guest today, so I guess we could go ahead and introduce him.
Yeah, happy Moundville Monday, everybody. Today we have Dr. Knight. He's the Curator Emeritus of American Archaeology for UA Museums. Good morning, Dr. Knight.
Good morning. Greetings from somewhere just outside Bessemer.
Oh.
Well, thank you for joining us today for a very important and very interesting topic, which we will get to in a second. So while we are broadcasting, feel free to ask us any questions in the comments. If you have any questions or comments, so leave them there. And as a reminder, this is live, so anything can happen. So just hang in there with us in case we have any issues. All right, so now that we've gotten all that kind of business out of the way, Dr. Knight, how should we get started?
Well, we can, my understanding is the topic is the Moundville theft. And so I guess this is a little unusual for your webcast, because we're going to be talking about a crime, a burglary
yes.
specifically, and that changes the tone of things a little bit. But you know, it's a serious crime. We'll be talking about an antiquities theft that occurred at the University of Alabama, which, as far as I can tell, is the most important antiquities theft that's ever happened in the eastern United States. And as far as I know, it may be the most important antiquities theft that's ever happened in the history of the United States. I just have never heard of something quite this big. So, and quite frankly, that people who have heard me talk about this before, a lot of them tend to be outraged about it. And if you're listening into this and you're outraged by what's about to be said, well, I have to join you. I'm outraged too about the thing. So that's just sort of the setup. And so let me sort of position myself. I was not around at the time of this crime, but I joined the faculty of the University of Alabama Department of Anthropology in the late 1980s, and this happened before that. But I became chair of that department in the late 90s, and became very interested in it and learned all I can about it. But I'm not necessarily the best expert on this topic. But I've tried to learn as much as I can about it over the years, and as you'll see when I get into my story, I've tried a couple of times to shed some light on this. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. I also have a connection with the museum. As you said, I'm curator emeritus of American Archaeology, so I've had some involvement, not just with the Department of Anthropology, but also with the museum for many years. So sort of to get started, we can go to the scene of the crime. Can we start the first slide?
Yeah, I have a question too. I know you're going to talk about this a little bit later, but I know it's the Erskine Ramsay. So who is he?
Who is Erskine Ramsay? Well, that's the name. That's the name of the building. Okay, yeah. So right now you're seeing a slide of a Google Earth slide of Moundville, and So you'll see the perimeter road. If you're familiar with Moundville at all, there you can see the perimeter road winding around the mounds, and the museum is off there to the left on the western side. And then the complex of buildings off to the northeast, you'll see that off on a side road, just that white rectangle up there. One of those buildings is the Erskine Ramsay Archaeological Repository. And so who is Erskine Ramsay, or who was he? Erskine Ramsay was a Birmingham industrialist, a wealthy man in the coal and iron business. And he was named to the Board of Regents of the Alabama Museum of Natural History back when Eugene Allen Smith was still alive and director of the museum. And in fact, several Birmingham industrialists were on that Board of Regents at the time. And Erskine Ramsay stayed on the Board of Regents from the late 1920s all the way through, I think, the early 1950s. And so he was one of the most important contributors, boosters, and so forth to the museum system then. And his name is very prominent, and he's the person who ponied up the money to build that building.
Okay.
So that's what happened there. So that is the scene of the crime. That facility, one of those buildings anyway, up in that upper right northeast corner of the park. And to sort of tell you what is in that building, we need to go back in time a little bit, about 90, well, exactly 90 years ago, as a matter of fact. So if you could have the next slide. So there we go, 1930, spring of 1930, 90 years ago. The Alabama State Museum of Natural History up to that time did not have an archaeological program. But the director at that time, which was Walter B. Jones, decided that had a strong interest in what's now Moundville Archaeological Park, and the Board of Regents of the museum at that time persuaded themselves that they were going to buy it. So they did. They raised the private money to buy what's now Moundville Archaeological Park and turn it over to the Alabama Museum of Natural History. And almost immediately, they started a program of archaeology, and with the museum staff in charge and hiring as many people as they could employ. And by the way, this was during, right in the middle of the Great Depression. So it was difficult for anyone to have any sort of budget to do this. But fortunately, Erskine Ramsay himself, who later contributed the money to build that building, he gave the museum a grant of several $1,000s to begin an archaeological program. So they did. In the spring of 1930, they began digging. At first, pretty unsystematically, because there were no trained archaeologists at the park. But gradually, through the 1930s, they improved their methods and were in contact with some of the major archaeologists in the country, and it became a well-known program. So here we have David DeJarnett, one of the who's seated over to the right. He was one of the junior curator at that time, and he was in charge of this particular group of 20 people. And digging like this was done in many places all over what's now Moundville Archaeological Park. And in the process of doing that, literally millions of artifacts were recovered and cataloged into the museum system and put in bags, and then the bags were put in boxes, labeled and so forth, and cataloged into the museum for further study. So let's do the next slide. So there were kind of two things going on in the early 1930s at Moundville. One was archaeological excavations, but the other was turning the place for the first time into a public park. And to do that, it was converted from what had been just farmers' fields, cotton fields, with trees growing over all the mounds, into a nice cleared place, the place that you see now. And this is a picture taken in 1936, and what you see there is the row of mounds on the west side of the park. That's the side of the park where the museum is now. And you see some things there. You see the mounds now cleared of trees. They've removed the trees, and they're starting to sod the mounds to make that green park that we have now. and you see a sort of perimeter road, but it's not the same perimeter road that we have now. That you'll notice the perimeter road goes to the east of that row of mounds where it doesn't right now. And that mound that road that you see in the foreground is not there either. But in the background to the left side, that's a big excavated area. That's where archaeologists are engaged in a very large scale excavation. So, and you'll see a couple of wooden buildings there. Those buildings are built they're temporary buildings that were built to cover excavations in progress. And so this was done with the help of the Civilian Conservation Corps, one of those relief agencies that were developed in the early 1930s under the administration of President Roosevelt to put people to work. And a couple of things that the Civilian Conservation Corps was very good at was doing large-scale archaeology, because that kind of work needs a lot of people. And also building parks. They built parks all over the state of Alabama and many other states. So they were doing two things at once here: constructing the park as you see it today, which is very largely a product of the Civilian Conservation Corps' involvement, and also doing these massive excavations, particularly in the late 1930s. They weren't simply digging all over the place. They were specifically excavating in places that were going to be disturbed by building the park. So the current roadway that you see around the park that you drive along when you're at Moundville Archaeological Park, that entire roadway was going to disturb a lot of the park, and so the footprint of that roadway had to be excavated, and the footprints of the major buildings that were built at the time, those areas had to be excavated before those buildings were built. So it was more of in the late 30s, it was more of a salvage archaeology rather than just digging anywhere as it was at the very beginning. So that's sort of the background as to what was going on at Moundville. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so as part of all of this work going on during the 1930s, archaeological work was going on all over Alabama, especially in the Tennessee Valley, down in the Gulf Coast, near Mobile Bay, different parts of Alabama. Bessemer, Alabama, where I live, had a big project going on. And the Works Progress Administration, which is another one of those 1930s organizations, gave a large grant to the Alabama Museum of Natural History. And what they did with that was they set up something called a statewide archaeological laboratory. This very large building in Birmingham, where artifacts from all over, from all of the excavations that were being done at the time, came into this central archaeological laboratory and were cataloged into the system and measured and photographed and bagged and boxed and so forth for further study. This was a big operation. We only see about 4 ladies working here, but this operation had something like five professional archaeologists and something like 130 workers doing this work. There was a lot of work to be done. So lots and lots of artifacts were coming in, not just from Moundville, but from all over the state and being cataloged. And so what happened then was the interference of World War II. The idea originally was going to be that all of these artifacts from Moundville were being excavated were obviously going to be written up, were going to be published, there was going to be a publication, more than one publication probably, to describe what was being found. But all of that came to a screeching halt in 1941, 1942, when the United States entered into World War II. And the Works Progress Administration, the outfit that staffed this Central Archaeological Laboratory, was shut down. So all that material, and it really is a vast amount of material, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of boxes, had to be moved to Tuscaloosa and Moundville from Birmingham. So they did what they could. They filled up the basement of Smith Hall, which is the current museum on campus of the University of Alabama, and they filled up. They built as many shelves as they could in the first building that you come to when you come into Moundville Archaeological Park, where you pay your fee to get in. That we called it the first building, the administration building. That in 1942 was stocked floor to ceiling with shelving, with hundreds and hundreds of boxes of all of this archaeological material, and also the entire basement of that building was filled up with artifacts. So they were sort of jammed to the gills with no real place to do the research, and nothing but at that time basically storing the artifacts. And the principal archaeologist at the time, Walter B. Jones, was the director of the museum, and David D. Jarnett was the curator who was doing a lot of the archaeology. Both of them joined the military, and they served during World War II in the Pacific Theater for years. And both of them came back to the museum after that and faced immediately this big problem of how are we possibly going to organize and keep this material under the standards that we want. So that's where Erskine Ramsay stepped in again and said, okay, what we need there is a curation facility. We need a special building to house all this stuff. So let's go to the next slide. There it is in 1947. It's a T-shaped building. The Erskine Ramsay Archaeological Research Center is what they call it to start with. And the front part of that was laboratory space. At that time, it has a front door, and you can see that bigger section in the back was 4 stories of storage. It's nothing but shelves and boxes, and so that was going to be the facility in which all the material then could be studied. And as part of that overall plan, Erskine Ramsay also contributed money to build student housing. There was going to be a dormitory there, and there was also going to be 2 cottages for married students. Now, they ran out of money before they could build all that, but they finished one of the cottages for married students, which is still there. And so those were the 2, at the time, those were the 2 buildings that were finished. And so over a period of time, they moved the artifacts out of Smith Hall basement, and they moved all the artifacts out of the first building, the administration building, in its basement. And they put them all here in good order on these shelves at Moundville. So that's basically the story there. Now, if we could go to the next slide, let's take a look inside that building. That's what it looks like now. One of the floors of that building, and as you can see, there's nothing but storage of boxes that are labeled from what site they came from, what part of the site they came from, what depth, and so forth. And those boxes are all numbered and all inventoried. It wouldn't have looked much different then, except that the boxes were slightly larger and slightly a different color. They were brown boxes at that point. But it's the same idea now. And so let's see what happens on the next slide. What have we got? Okay, but now what we've got is, instead of putting the more fragile artifacts, and here are some pottery vessels, instead of putting the fragile artifacts and wrapping them in newspaper and sort of stacking them within cardboard boxes, which was the old practice, nowadays we have them in metal drawers, and the drawers have styrofoam bottoms and styrofoam dividers so that nothing gets jostled or nothing gets. This is a much safer environment. So part of that facility now is devoted to that kind of shelving for the fragile material. That didn't exist in 1947, but the rest of it pretty much did. So the idea then is that what curation is for people to come and study these artifacts. And some people get the idea that, well, once the artifacts have been photographed or measured or whatever, that's it, right? And that's not it at all, because each new generation of students, or each new generation of professors who have an interest in this material will see it differently and will have different approaches to studying the material. So these collections get studied over and over and over again, using different methods, some new technologies that we have. For example, in 1947, we didn't have radiocarbon dating, and we do now. So that's just one example of a different approach to returning to the same collections. And we curate these basically forever. That's the idea. So it's a regular procedure now at this facility for, let's say, a researcher who's interested in some particular, the artifacts from some particular site, or maybe a subset of artifacts from that site, maybe just the stone artifacts, who wants to study that, and they'll put in a request, and there is a curator of collections devoted to archaeology who's in residence or doesn't live down there, but that's what he does. And an appointment is made, and the boxes are the appropriate boxes are taken from Erskine Ramsay and brought to a laboratory space, and the researcher then spends whatever time is needed, a week or two, maybe. Sometimes there are more than one researcher. There's more than one researcher there, and then once the study's finished, the artifacts are packed back in their boxes, or put back on their shelves, and returned to Erskine Ramsay. So this is a process that's been going on a long time, and it's going on at a pretty accelerated pace now. Now, originally, when the Moundville material was moved to Erskine Ramsay, it took 20 years really before we got a serious student to come even begin to study the huge amount of artifacts from Moundville. The first one was in 1967. A Harvard student by the name of Douglas McKenzie came down and was sort of just blown away and overwhelmed by what he saw, the amount, just sheer amount of material. But stayed and looked at the excavation records and studied and measured and photographed as much as he could, and came up with a pretty good dissertation in Harvard University on Moundville. And a few years after that, another graduate student, this one at the University of California, named Christopher Peebles, came along, and with new methods, with brand new ideas, and made a new major study of a lot of the Moundville material. Let me just sort of throw in here that here we have a set of two dissertations that were started in the 1960s, and they haven't even begun really to even touch what can be done with this collection. Neither one of them studied a fraction of it. So with everything that's been done then and since then with the Moundville collections, there are still large chunks of the collections from the 1930s, and that's the main period. I think everything you're looking at in this particular slide was excavated during those 1930s excavations. There have been really very, very few excavations at Moundville, just minor, at least minor in area and compared to what they did in the 1930s. So the vast, vast majority of what's curated in that collection, in that facility, comes from those 1930s excavations. So there are big parts of that collection that have never been looked at by anybody, by any professional archaeologist. They've been sitting, they've been rebagged and reboxed from time to time, so they're in good order, in good shape. But they've never been looked at. So that there's this continuing need then to study this material. So it's not just overflow from what's not on exhibit in the museum. So that's one idea that some people have. Well, this is just the extra stuff, but it's not that at all. This is the research collection, and the vast majority of it isn't like what you're looking at there. It's broken pottery that has numbers written on it, and little bits of shattered flint, and all the little clues from the daily life of Native Americans in the past that really tell as much of a story as these artifacts, as these complete artifacts do. So that's the idea of curation, and this is an extremely nationally important, internationally important collection of artifacts that people literally come from all over the place to study. Just to give you one example, in PhD dissertations, I think we're up to something like 21 PhD dissertations written on Moundville by itself. So that's a lot, right? And we've had something like, I think the number now is 29 master's theses that have been written about Moundville archaeology using these collections, and the number is still rising. We have modern students still working on this material. So it's an ongoing process. It doesn't end. There's no end to it. and we have various other interest groups. Native American groups, for example, are very frequently coming to the facility. They want to see what they want to see what we have there, and these appointments are accommodated, and it's not really set up very well for tour groups, but once in a while they'll bring in a few people at a time to do a little walkthrough for that to show them. So anyway, that's sort of the setup for the great robbery, right?
I have a question.
Sure.
Would you say that is Erskine Ramsay like the first curation repository in the state? Was it the first one built? And are there more?
There are more, but that Erskine Ramsay was definitely the first one that was built, and so it's sort of considered the central one, in the state of Alabama. Now, other organizations have their own curation repositories. South Alabama, for example, has one, and over across the state line, we've got both big universities in Mississippi have their own curation facilities, but a lot of the organizations that do archaeological research these days don't have their own archaeological facilities, so they make an arrangement with the museum at Alabama to curate what they have. So that building then is a regional repository. It's not just Moundville. It's not just things that the Alabama Museum of Natural History has worked on in their own projects. It incorporates projects that are at least statewide and in some cases region-wide, because there are collections now from, for example, South Carolina, as far away as that. But so it is a large regional facility, and it was definitely the first one in Alabama.
Awesome. My other question is a cool logistical question. I did not know that the first building was used as a storage space, which I thought was really cool. It's something I just learned. But were workers from the Works Progress Association that was in Birmingham, did any of those people help move the collection from that building over to the other, or is there a different time lapse?
That program was shut down so rapidly that there was no time to do that, as far as I can tell. And so the staff of the Alabama Museum of Natural History had to do it themselves, just truckload by truckload, with this going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, to eventually, over a period of weeks, get everything from Birmingham packed into that space. So it was really just the staff of the museum doing it, and as far as I can tell, really just sort of two people working on it.
Oh, wow.
So we can just move to the theft itself now, right?
Sure. Let's go
to the crime. What we have to do is go to So there was a lot going on in 1980, the year 40 years ago. 1980, there was a whole lot going on at Moundville, and part of that was because those old enough to remember will remember that the construction of the Tennessee Tom Bigby Waterway was going on, and so there was a great deal of federal money being spent in excavating archaeological sites that were going to be destroyed by the Tennessee Tom Bigby Waterway, and that involved hiring crews that were very large, and so lots of people doing lots of archaeology, spending lots of federal money, were coming and going. And Moundville and Tuscaloosa were sorts of hubs for a lot of this activity. The Alabama Museum of Natural History had a large part in this, but so did lots of other organizations, and so people were coming and going, using the Erskine Ramsay facility for the curation and storage of a lot of the material that was being dug up by this waterway project. And another big thing that was happening, not as big, but important, was that Christopher Peebles, who was the second person to write a dissertation on Moundville, had a National Science Foundation project centered on the Moundville and the Moundville area. And so graduate students from the University of Michigan were pretty regularly visiting Moundville and studying the old collections about Moundville in the Erskine Ramsay facility. One of the first to do that was a student named, at that time, named Vin Stepanidis, who's now a professor at the University of North Carolina. And he's the one that took this picture. Actually, his wife took this picture. He and his wife spent a long time because part of Dr. Stepanidis' dissertation was about Moundville pottery. And so they systematically looked at and photographed and measured all the intact pottery vessels from Moundville. And this is one of the pictures taken by Lori Stepanidis, Vin Stepanidis' wife, who was dutifully there to help him get through this mass of material. And you see the scale there in the label, NED10 on the left. And this is a typical Moundville bottle, and it shows an engraved design showing the winged antlered serpent, which is one of the main designs. And by the way, just sort of for those of you who can sort of visually memorize things, I'll show you the same pot in a minute because it's part of the story. This is one that was stolen. But what we had there then at the end of the research, which was in 1978, I guess, which was that was basically an inventory of all of these vessels that we really didn't have before, a complete inventory and where they were, what boxes they were in, and that becomes a part of the story. So the next thing that happened, this is in the spring of 1980, is another graduate student from the University of Michigan, whose name is Margaret Harden. She had been to Moundville before, and she was in the middle of working on a different project using Moundville pottery vessels. So she was going to go to Moundville and go back to the Erskine Ramsay facility and go right back to work where she had left off. And she knew where everything was and opened one of the boxes to start where she had left off. And some pots were not there. And so the first thing she did was get on the phone to talk to Dr. Stepanidis, who was not doctor yet, but he was at that time still in Michigan, and asked Dr. Stepanidis if he had moved any of it. But the answer was no. He hadn't been to Erskine Ramsay since his own study. So no, he hadn't moved it. And so it dawned on this graduate student, Margaret Harden, that a theft had happened. This material should have been in that box, and it wasn't. So she notified the authorities at the time, the director of the museum, and so forth, and the chair of the anthropology department at the University of Alabama, and said that she thought there had been a theft, and they didn't believe her. As far as Margaret's story goes, that she was even accused of sort of misplacing the material herself. And,
oh, wow.
And it was kind of awkward and awful for this poor graduate student to claim that there had been a theft, and nobody believed her. But it pretty soon dawned on people that absolutely there had been a theft. And Vin Stepanidis himself came down to Moundville and compared his inventory of the pots to what was still on the shelves. And as it turned out, Margaret Harden had apparently interrupted a theft in progress. In other words, the thieves were coming back for another shipment, and the boxes for the second shipment were all stacked up nice and neat along the side wall, not anywhere near on the shelves where they should have been. And so if she hadn't discovered that, the theft would have been a lot worse than it actually was. So what was taken? So what we know was taken were dozens of boxes of those Moundville artifacts. The thieves, even though there were artifacts from other sites, they specifically targeted Moundville, and they targeted artifacts that were the fancier of the artifacts. In other words, the thieves knew exactly what they were doing and went out of their way not to just grab random boxes off the shelf, but to get the better, the fancier, the painted, the engraved, the pots that were worth more, and took those. And one of the reasons we know that was that a few years earlier, in 1976, I guess it was, there was an exhibition on campus at the University of Alabama in Garland Hall, and it was set up. The exhibition was set up by an art historian who worked at that time on campus, and it featured sort of the best of Moundville, those artifacts that were of interest to art historians, to artists. And so there was a little catalog published of that. And if you compare that catalog to what was actually stolen, you'll see that something like 70% of the fancier artifacts from that collection were now gone. Now, as a percentage of the whole collection that was taken, it's really only about a fifth. Something like 1 out of 20% or so were missing. But of the exhibitable, fancy, worth, valuable, seriously valuable artifacts, it's more like 70% of the collection was gone. And what we knew about was only the pots. But what has to be emphasized is that there were many other artifacts in those same boxes that we didn't have an inventory of because nobody had studied them yet. And so there were shell artifacts and bone artifacts and stone artifacts and copper artifacts in those same boxes. And we still don't know to this day exactly what those were. There is simply no inventory. We know the boxes that were taken. We know what pottery vessels were taken, but not those other artifacts. So we really have no clear idea of what was taken. So that being said, so back to the story, once it dawned on everybody that it was an important, very important theft had happened, a burglary had happened. The University of Alabama, the director at the time of the Office of Archaeological Research, which is based at Moundville, compiled a set of photographs, and these photographs were all taken from the set of photographs like this one here that was made by Dr. Stepanidis, and had those published in a special section of a journal called the Journal of Field Archaeology, which at that time anyway had a special section devoted to stolen goods. And the reason they did that was because the prevailing theory at the time was that that the theft was orchestrated in order to ship this material overseas to major antiquities dealers living somewhere else. Germany and Japan were often mentioned as possible destinations for this material. The number of pottery vessels that were taken, we know that it's 264, and again, it's the more valuable material. And so we had this inventory, and we had photographs of all that, and so the FBI became involved. Special Agent Al King of the Tuscaloosa office of the FBI was assigned to the case, and the first thing he did was to compile a photographic inventory of those pottery vessels, so including this one here and all of the rest, so 264 of those, to have a sort of photo catalog to use. And then they proceeded to do interviews, and they interviewed the entire staff of the university and so forth, working at that working for the museum at the time. They interviewed all of the workers who were coming and going and doing these archaeological projects for the Tin Tom Waterway. They got interviewed and so forth. But they got apparently some promising. Some people were more suspect than others, I guess. But one thing that the FBI investigation found was that there had been no break-in. There was no evidence of forced entry into the repository, and somebody with a key had gotten in there and done this. It was, in retrospect, it was pretty easy to do because it was a building isolated behind some trees, and so anybody with a key could have backed up a pickup truck or whatever else, and sort of at a time when no one else was around and could take their sweet time, just going through the boxes, finding what they wanted, and taking them away. So no break-in. It might have even been done in broad daylight for all I know. So that was interesting. So the FBI decided that they would try to find out how many people had keys to the place, and the number was pretty astonishing. 27 people had keys to that facility. The reason being that it was such an important facility for all of these projects that were going on at one time. 27, that's far more people than were working, for the museum at that time. And so it just opened up a big can of worms. So what happened after that was the statute of limitations over the years for the original theft expired. No arrests were made, and it just sort of went dormant. There was no announcement by the University of Alabama that this had happened, and nothing in the local newspapers that it had happened, and so that was that. I wasn't there at the time. I was when the theft happened. I was finishing my dissertation at the University of Florida in Gainesville. I knew about it because all of the professional community, word spread pretty quickly through there, and so and I had worked at Moundville before, so I knew all the players and who they were and so forth. I knew them personally, and I knew the facility. I had been in Erskine Ramsay in the early 1970s to go fetch something, but I had nothing to do with it other than hearing about it, and so basically, after 7 years, it was a cold case, and the FBI dropped the case and did nothing with it. And later on, years later, when I started inquiring about it, I called the local FBI office in Tuscaloosa. They referred me to the Birmingham office of the FBI, and they were polite to me, but they said they really didn't have much, about that. The records of the interviews, I gather, were destroyed, and there really wasn't much to do, and they wouldn't have shown it to me anyway because I'm not a member of law enforcement. But I was curious to find out just sort of what there still was about that. Anyway, when I was chair of the anthropology department, which would have been in the late 1990s, I started asking about this, and they said, there weren't any records from the museum about it, and I thought that was surprising, but there weren't. Anyway, I decided to do something about it, and asked around if I should announce this to the public, and the answer was sure. So I did. In 2003, I guess 23 years after the fact, I made public. An event was organized at Smith Hall, and I announced it to the public. The Office of Archaeological Research took the photographs that we had and made a very nice website, which is still up, that you can go to, and you can browse through the pots and take a look. And there's the URL there on the screen. But let's just go to some of the artifacts that were stolen and show you a couple more slides of that. Yeah, so here's some pottery bottles in the shapes of humans, and some of the engraved artifacts, some in the shape of frogs, modeled artifacts. Next slide. I think there are 3 of these. Yeah, the color slides and so forth. We don't have many color slides of these. Just very few artifacts had any color slides made, but they at the time put up a stolen pottery vessel website. Here it is. Next slide. Now, nothing happened there. The University of Alabama police got a few leads from a tip line that they had established after my announcement. And they followed up on some of those, but it just didn't work. And after about a year, they quit getting new tips. I thought some of the tips were pretty good, but again, I'm not in law enforcement, so I don't know. So anyway, we fast forward after my retirement to 2018, and I said, I'll give this one more shot, and this time I'll try to raise a reward and see how that works. So we did. And it was at a barbecue in spring of 2018 when I just told the little story that I've just told you about this theft and the fact that it was a big unsolved mystery. This is a huge hole in the heritage of, I think, in the heritage of our region and the heritage of our state. And nothing had turned up on the market, which was a little strange. The other similar smaller thefts of antiquities had occurred in other museums, but usually they turn up for sale somewhere, and antiquities shows or flea markets or something, and somebody will notice, and somebody will find them. That's what happened at a theft in some similar theft in Georgia. Eventually, many of the artifacts were recovered. But that told me that, that these things never were put on the market. If they had been, we'd know about it. Mm-hmm. So anyway, decided again to at a barbecue where I was present, I announced this thing and I said, well, who's in with me? I'll contribute a little bit, see what we can raise for a reward. And by the time I walked out the door, we had $12,000. I thought that's pretty good for a reward. So I announced that, and as soon as I did, the number rose, and pretty soon we had a reward of $25,000, which I had not anticipated that we would get. As soon as people heard about it, they wanted to contribute to the reward. So there it was, and that was announced in the summer of 2018, 2 years ago. And then some of the pots started showing up. These three. One day, the police, the University of Alabama police investigator who was assigned to the case, got in touch with someone at the Office of Archaeological Research and asked to authenticate some pottery vessels that had been turned over. These three right here, just three. And if you were paying attention to one of those slides earlier, you'll recognize the one on the left. That's one that was returned. So these three, and I think the next slide shows them on. Let's see. Yeah, they're on exhibit now, and two of them show in the museum at Moundville. Two of them show the winged serpent, and the other one shows a design of engraved skulls and hands, which is another sort of typical religious design of the period. So obviously, there was a crack in the case, right? But the person who had turned over the material was actually an attorney representing an anonymous client. Mm-hmm. And so there was no way to learn anything more about it than that because of attorney-client privilege. And even though I thought that was a giant crack in the case, no more objects have surfaced. And so we still have, the reward still stands. The reward is for anyone who brings us information that leads to the recovery of this collection can collect the $25,000. So it's still, it's still obviously a major. I think the next slide, yeah, there's the tip line still exists, and this tip line is still operational. It goes. You can leave a message, and the University of Alabama police will get it and follow up if it's credible. And that's sort of where we are with this. And yeah, so there it is. It's a private reward by the Associates for the return of Moundville artifacts, and the confidential tip line, the tip line number. And that's the sad story of the whole thing. But at least there's a glint of hope in the thing that. And it tells me sort of one thing, that original theory that the collection had been sold overseas to some overseas collector. Mm-hmm. Well, the person that turned them in was a Tuscaloosa attorney. And what that tells me is that one of my little private theories about the case might be true, that it never went very far. It never was sold. Some person with means and maybe in the Tuscaloosa area possibly still has that collection. And they may, who knows, they might have been spooked by the early involvement of the FBI. So there you have it. That's the story of the great antiquities theft from Moundville. Sad as it is.
Is the FBI still involved in the case?
Not directly, but since since the 9/11 event happened, law enforcement agencies cooperate with one another a lot better than they used to. So basically, the FBI's attitude says they're hands off right now, but if they're needed, for example, if any of this stuff has gone across state lines, they automatically become involved, and so they're ready to go. But right now, it's an open investigation by the University of Alabama Police Department.
It looks like some of our commenters might have some speculations about some things. So,
Sure.
So is there any indication for who might have taken it based on the pots that were returned? Do we have any speculations on why this certain person might have had these certain artifacts?
It's really hard to say, but it's interesting to me that there were 3 of them. Why 3? Why those 3? And one of the things that I'm just going to guess wildly here. It's been 40 years. Maybe this material is now in the hands of another generation, somebody else, and who knows what their values are. Or maybe it's been split up between several people in a new generation. So maybe that has happened. I'm just wildly guessing here, but it's it's been 40 years after all.
Yeah, so there is another speculation that it could have been an inside job from somebody who had one of those keys because they would have known which ones to take. So is that something that had been talked about before?
I absolutely consider it an inside job. Not necessarily an inside job by one of the employees of the Alabama Museum of Natural History, but remember that a lot of people that didn't work for the Alabama Museum had keys to the place because of all of this work that was going on that had employees drawn from every walk of life, that had keys because they were moving artifacts in and out because of these big archaeological projects going on. I absolutely, so it might have been an illicit key, I guess, a copied key I don't know, but it sure looks like whoever took that material knew exactly what they were doing and knew exactly what to take. So, yeah.
And maybe it could have been someone with money who wanted to, like you said, sell them in some kind of market, in some sort of auction fashion, something like that. Somebody who had knowledge and maybe some wealth. So that's a good speculation as well. It sure makes sense to me that
whoever did this most recently has probably gotten some money. But then again, I just have to guess.
Yeah, and we did have a question from Ronald here who said that I understood that some of the artifacts had been on loan to the Smithsonian and were therefore saved. Is this true?
The ones that were saved were actually not on loan to the Smithsonian, but they were saved because they were on exhibit in the museum, in the Moundville Museum. Those prize possessions at the time weren't touched. So that may be a little bit of confusion because right now we've got many of the Moundville artifacts on loan from the Smithsonian that are now on exhibit at the museum. But yeah, some of them were saved because they were on exhibit.
That is really fascinating. So you said earlier that something like 70% was the number. 70% were taken.
No, the proportion of the pottery vessels. I have to be very specific about that because we don't know about all the other artifacts. That's more like a fifth of the collection.
Okay.
Of those was taken, but the 70% number is basically what I would call the exhibitable artifacts, the fancier ones.
Okay, so do we have any idea what number might still be out there?
Well, you can do subtract 3 from 264, so that's how many whole pots are still out there.
Okay.
But then again, there's all this unknown quantity of other artifacts. We could identify them pretty easily. They've got, or at least they had catalog numbers written on them at the time, and we have a pretty good idea of what kinds of artifacts come from Moundville as opposed to other things. No big spear points or anything like that, or arrow. What collectors think of as arrowheads. It's not that kind of material at all. But so we, even if something turned up that wasn't pottery, I think we'd have a pretty good idea whether or not it was part of that theft.
Well, so what do you hope will come from speaking about these kinds of things? Because it sounded like before the University of Alabama didn't want to talk about it, I guess, for fear of more theft, or I don't know why they would have been shy about talking about it at the time. But what do you think is good and positive about talking about it now?
Well, for one thing, we didn't have, even at the time in 2003 when I first went public with this, we didn't have social media. We didn't have the capability of getting the word out anywhere near like the capability we have now to get that word out. And I just hope, I hope I don't sound like a curator saying, this is material that belongs to us and we want it back. A lot of curators do sound like that, but I don't work for the Alabama Museum of Natural History anymore. But I think I've always felt I felt about it a little bit more broadly than that. There are many interest groups that have an interest in this material, and I don't want to forget our Native American friends who really, consider this a very special resource, and they, of course, are outraged about this. I hope, and as much as any of us, and they want it returned. There's the general public that really can learn from this material, understand understand the heritage of our area. There's a lot to learn from this material. Art historians really value this material, and then of course there are the students who can still, and the professionals who can still learn a lot from these artifacts, and who need to continue investigating the story and enhancing the story of what happened to our Native American ancestors in this area.
Yeah, hopefully we'll continue to get the word out, and hopefully somebody will come forward at some point, and hopefully we'll be able to find these in the future, because that is information about the state of Alabama and the people who lived here that is not around for us to study and research. So that is very, very important. Well, thank you, Dr. Knight, for coming on Museums from Your Home to tell us this story, this really intriguing, fascinating story that is still somewhat unsolved. So if anybody does have any tips or any suggestions, you can call 205-348-2800 to submit any of that information. So that would be really helpful if you do have any information about this theft. Well, I think that's going to do it, unless you have any other questions.
I got one overarching question, which I know people are going to ask. I think we've discussed it earlier. If they do bring in or have any information about the artifacts, or the artifacts are like they turn up, will those people be prosecuted? What is the process?
Well, that's not up to me.
Mm-hmm.
Whether people are prosecuted or not. As I mentioned before, the original statute of limitations, the statute of limitations on the original theft has expired, so that doesn't come into play. But what hasn't expired is possession of stolen property. Is legally, this material belongs to the state of Alabama, and it is stolen property. And whether or not the people are prosecuted, that depends on that will be a decision made by the University of Alabama Police, probably in collaboration with the university administration.
Well, this is a story, as we learned through this hour, that has affected lots of people over time, and from different states and from different fields of study. So it's a really important thing. So hopefully one day justice will prevail. All right. Well, I think we're about at our hour time, so I guess we'll go ahead and wrap this up. So thank you again, Dr. Knight, for coming on and sharing this story and for elaborating on what happened. And you've taught me a lot, so I appreciate that, and I'm sure everybody watching enjoyed it as well. All right. Well, that's going to do it for this Museums from Your Home live stream. We'll be doing this every weekday, Monday through Friday at 10 a.m. And each day will feature a different aspect of UA museums. Tomorrow, we're going to be hanging out with the Gorgas House Museum and the Mildred Westervelt Warner Transportation Museum. So head over to their Facebook pages for that. And if you are enjoying what we are doing here with Museums from Your Home, and you would like to support us, you can go to give.ua.edu/museums and become a supporting member of UA Museums. If you would like to find out more about what we're doing with this initiative, you can go to museums.ua.edu/museums from your home. That will give you all of our live stream schedules and our links to where everything is. It also has a link to our UA Museums Color Our Collections coloring books. So if you want to do some coloring, you can do that. And we also have educational resources from Discovering Alabama, the Alabama Museum of Natural History, and Moundville Archaeological Park. So you can head over there for all of that information. You can also follow us and subscribe on YouTube at youtube.com/UA Museums, and that will give you a way to have access to all of our video content. You'll never miss a live stream. You'll never miss a Moundville Monday video if you go and subscribe on YouTube. Well, I just want to do one last reminder. If you do have any information about the theft, you can call 205-348-2800. All right. Well, I think that is going to do it for this live stream. And thank you to everybody who is watching live and everybody who will watch in the future. Thank you for visiting UA Museums from Your Home. Well, I hope everybody has a great day.